Good evening, and welcome to the last session of COVID-19 and the Future of New York, sponsored as always by Thinkers Anonymous. Tonight is the culmination of an 8-week exploration of how the COVID-19 virus left New York City reeling from its impact and has sent it in a new direction that, even with all the excitement around reopening, is still very much out of focus. Over the last 2 months, we have engaged with the leading experts in their industries. They are the authorities on subjects that define this metropolitan area. They have lent their knowledge and experience to you, our attendees, providing guidance on what we can expect the city to be in the years ahead. I am your host, Kirk Tatnall, and it has been an absolute delight to organize this conference and engage with some of the most astute individuals in this town. They come bearing opinions, sometimes very sharp ones, but they're brave to make them when many others have said the opposite. And they are all cheerleaders of this city. And just as you and I have witnessed, they have seen the city dented and depressed, but with its vital signs still intact. A quick note of thanks to Risa Shoup, who last week brought us greater understanding of the challenges and triumphs ahead for live performance, and as Executive Director of the Alliance of Resident Theaters New York, for the acumen provided on the economics of the theater, particularly off-Broadway. And noting yesterday that Hadestown will open on September 2nd, almost 2 weeks ahead of other announced productions, it is yet another sign of the accelerated recovery we are now feeling on a daily basis. Predictions are as ready as water that have sought to define the path New York will take to fully reconstitute itself. Many continue to believe its best days are behind it, that the virtual has replaced to a large extent the physical, that the concentrated density of urban life typified by Manhattan is now a liability. We acknowledge the limitations that COVID-19 has exposed about our city, but tonight we seek a further vision, beyond this summer, beyond this year, beyond the calculations, to the forces that are shaping New York and urban areas around the globe, currents that have been in motion for years and that the pandemic only accelerated but did not create. To assist in this expedition, one last time, my dear friend Joe Basile, founder of Thinkers Anonymous. He will be fielding your questions, collating them, and posing them throughout the evening. Please submit them at any time during the hour. This is your conference to learn what you want. He is on standby. And our closing keynote speaker is an internationally recognized architect, author, and filmmaker who has interpreted and expanded the appreciation of cities around the globe through books, documentary films, and exhibitions, while enhancing the urban landscape through his own design projects. With Ric Burns, he conceived and wrote the award-winning 8-part public television series, New York, a documentary film, and its companion volume, New York, an illustrated history. His landmark study of the city and film, Celluloid Skyline, was hailed by Jane Jacobs herself as a marvelous, miraculous book. His design and research firm has developed architecture, exhibitions, media, film, and book projects for cultural and corporate partners around the country. His work has garnered him an Emmy Award and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He sits on the board of directors of the Skyscraper Museum, and this year, the American Institute of Architects elevated him to its prestigious College of Fellows. Ladies and gentlemen, James Sanders.
Thank you, Kurt, for that very gracious, very generous introduction. And thank
James,
you, Joe.
James, I can't hear you, unfortunately.
Oh, dear. Huh.
Oh, can you? Okay.
I can hear him just fine.
Sorry.
Okay. All right.
All right, we're all
Scared
good.
me there.
No,
Okay.
we're all good.
All right. Yes, so thank you very much. Thank you for asking me to be part of this incredible conversation, which features so many of the people that I have admired and studied. Ken Jackson, who I think was your initial speaker, was my teacher at Columbia College when I was an undergraduate, and he's been a great friend and colleague ever since. So it's a real honor to be here. I thought I might, you've given me a very nice introduction with all the formal things. I thought I might just say, add an informal word or two about how we got to, and I've gotten to where I am. I am a New Yorker, born and bred, the ultimate provincial New Yorker, born in Manhattan and lived here most of my life. And I went to public school in New York City, the Bronx High School of Science, Columbia University. I did spend some of my graduate education at MIT, but you just have to forgive me that. I am a practicing architect, which has given me a sort of an interesting viewpoint in that I have done that side by side with history and interpretation of the city. And, it's in the nature of architects almost inevitably to be thinking about the future, because they're kind of making the future and designing the future, buildings that and spaces that don't exist that they're thinking about. And along with that comes a kind of future orientation. And yet at the same time, I've spent a lot of my life thinking about the present of the city in the sense of the urban landscape of the city, but also the past of the city. I did write, spent 12 years working on a book about New York and film called Celluloid Skyline, as you've described. And that was a way to understand the city beyond what I thought were the sort of conventional modalities, or whatever you want to call it, of architecture and planning, by using the insights of filmmakers, Hollywood filmmakers in many cases, to show us sort of hidden secrets about the city that we might not understand otherwise. And so I did that book as a kind of, to be a sort of intermediary between the world of film and the world of architecture, but specifically about to sort of uncover the inner meaning, as it were, of the city landscape. And I was working on that when Ric Burns and I, who I'd known in college, Ric, began conceiving our series on New York. This was back in 1993. It is rather stunning to me to think that I've been working one way or the other on this project for whatever it is now, 27 or 28 years. We wanted to conceive of telling the story of New York, we were both convinced, as a national story. This was a very important part of this. It was a series that was going to be for public television nationally, shown all across the country. And we distinguished it from the kinds of local shows that are about, Coney Island and places like that, and how they make bagels in the Bronx, and which are wonderful shows. But our show had to be national. And again, as we were working on the script and then on the film, we were conscious of the fact that it had to be of interest to people outside the city. So that was part of it. We developed the scripts and produced the first 5 episodes. People may remember, went on the air in 1999, and then we had 2 more episodes up our sleeve, episodes 6 and 7, which brought the story of New York more or less to the present day, and aired on the 3rd week of September 2001. Kind of extraordinary timing that obviously we hadn't planned for. We couldn't change the film at that point to do anything about 9/11, except for one thing, which most people don't know, but the final piece of film, it was actually the credits sequence, the end titles of the film, were a piece of footage that we had of an interview that we had done. And we thought that after all this hours and hours and hours of serious show, people might want something kind of a little lighter in spirit. And we had a piece of footage of an interview we had done with Donald J. Trump, still developer in New York. And Donald is talking about how hot New York has gotten. And in his usual way, which in those days, of course, we all just thought was kind of amusing. And we realized, though, that this was inappropriate now for the way to end the show. So we stripped that out, and we stripped in some beautiful footage that we had of the topping off of the North Tower of the World Trade Center in 1971, and talked about it as a symbol of the resilience of the city, which is a theme I'll get to. In any case, it was obvious then that we needed to do a new episode about the Trade Center itself, and we basically told the story of the Trade Center as our 8th episode, effectively encapsulating the entire show, using the Trade Center as kind of a prism. And that aired in 2003, and then we all went off to do our different things, although Ric and I collaborated on a film about Andy Warhol. And about 7 or 8 years ago, we began to feel it was time to make a new episode about New York in the 21st century. So we began work on that, and that was going to be 1 episode. and was still going to be one episode until March and April of 2020, when we realized that there was no way we were going to tell the whole story of pandemic and fit it into a single 2-hour episode, along with everything else that had happened in New York in the interim since 9/11. So we now are going to be creating 2 new episodes of the series, which will air roughly this time next year. And we've just recently completed writing and producing a new edition of the companion volume, which some of you may have, of New York and Illustrated History, which will actually be published this fall. And that has the 2 episodes are redacted as chapters. So I have been for 3 years or 4 years deep in New York history of the last 20 years, and for the past year and months, in the strange experience of writing a history of New York effectively as it happens, which has been an odd and interesting experience. What I thought I would speak about today a little bit, having given you that background, is we've just gone through this extraordinary experience, in many ways unprecedented in the life of New York, and or any city. And of course, in this case, New York was, as it so often is, it was one place among many that was affected by this, but somehow it became the exemplar city, and for better or worse. So it's obviously in many ways for worse. You know, for many months in March and April, it was the epicenter of the virus in the United States, and in many ways in the world. It hadn't hit a large city quite the way it had New York. And so it became everybody's eyes focused on the city. And that would have been true just by the numbers. But of course, there's also the way in which there's a kind of a media thing in which a worldwide phenomenon isn't thought to have really happened unless in some way it affects New York. Think of all those science fiction movies where they want to show that, you know, something terrible is going on all around the world. Well, they have to show like an empty Manhattan, because then otherwise it wouldn't be convincing that it really had happened globally. And of course, the city lends itself so powerfully to these kinds of scenes, such that, you know, to see a suburb in which nobody is going outside, okay, well, there's a suburb in which nobody goes outside, but people don't go outside in the suburbs very much anyway. So what does that say? But to see Times Square, or to see Rockefeller Center, or to see the Oculus empty, carries a kind of a punch, a weight. And of course, that's what we saw in March and April of 2020, these kind of eerily deserted spaces, which people in fact did compare one way or another into apocalyptic films and so forth, post-apocalyptic films. So that was interesting. But I thought before we talk about that, it might be worth doing a little historical perspective, because one of the extraordinary things about something like this is that it makes you think about the city's history, and particularly the things that have happened in the city, and particularly the adverse things, the challenges, the catastrophes that have happened to the city over its history. And there have been many. And our book has many of them. And indeed, the last 20 years have seen, you know, in ways that no one would have expected, these at least 4 world historical catastrophes, starting with 9/11 itself and the city's attempt to recover from that. And then the great financial crisis and Great Recession of 2008, 2009, the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And then just when the city is kind of coming out of that in some way, Superstorm Sandy hits, and a huge amount of New York is put underwater. And the very premise of the city as a maritime city, as a city that grew out of its relationship to the ocean, its intimate relationship with the ocean, is now thrown into the notion of being an existential threat. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then, of course, the pandemic we're having in early 2020. New York, obviously, though, that's just in the last 20 years, one might say. But of course, the history of calamities and disasters in New York goes much farther back. And the original one, the one that was the scourge of pre-Civil War New York, and to some degree post-Civil War New York, was epidemics. That was the first great challenge of the large city. New York was not alone, certainly, and one would have to say that London was the great sort of exemplar of that problem. But New York certainly had it, and it was something new in the American experience when there had been a yellow fever epidemic in 1798. Of course, New York was tiny in 1798. It had just recovered from the Revolutionary War, and there might have been about, I don't know, 65,000 people or 60,000 people, essentially all south of Canal Street, roughly. But it was serious enough. People have been reminded recently that everybody who loves cities knows the words of the original urban antagonist, Thomas Jefferson, the man who sort of framed in many people's minds the kind of deep American antipathy to cities, and would write about them again and again as, cloaca of human nature and sewers of human experience. He hated them politically, but a lot of the one of the most famous quotes he has about sort of being pestilential to the health and morals of the common people, he was writing in 1800, specifically in reference to the 1798 epidemic. And it was convincing him that cities were not only this kind of political problem for his Jeffersonian Virginia planter vision of America, the yeoman farmer, which didn't really ever exist anyway, in the way he imagined it, but were actually physical threats to the commonweal. But that was the relatively small in scale. What was not small in scale were the epidemics that arrived in the 1830s, particularly in 1832. There was a cholera epidemic in New York, and it was devastating. And to read the account of it in our book, it's uncanny how much it reads. You could change the dates and names, and it reads almost exactly like the first 2 months, let's say, of the COVID epidemic, down to coming in from abroad. That was part of it. It was brought over on the ships. It's the first confirmed case. There were diarists like Philip Hone who were tracking it day by day, and they talked about the first confirmed case. The fact that it was not affecting all areas of the city. Well, even before I say that, there was an exodus of middle class and upper class New Yorkers who left the city to go to their estates, which would be in places like Greenwich Village and along the Hudson River. That too, of course, rang a very familiar bell. The fact that people could observe right away that it was not affecting all parts of the city equally, that the already emerging slum districts, they were tiny, but they were emerging, the areas around the 5 Points, the origins of the Lower East Side, were being more affected, more people were dying than other parts of the city. Obviously there was no understanding, there was not a deep understanding of how it was spread yet. That would come a few years later. But they were doctors and they could track things, and they were pretty smart. And they, another thing that was emerging very quickly was a kind of anti-urban idea that, the problem was all these people living in proximity to each other. And the doctors were the cool heads who were going, no, don't saddle this, this disease onto pre-existing social and economic problems and health problems. And so similarly, you get a few, even with the relatively primitive state of medicine at the time, there are some people whose words read very coolly and very foresightedly, that things were the epidemic was what it was and was not something else. And so that was a great thing of the 19th century, and of course by no means went away with cholera, tuberculosis, diphtheria. These were the scourges of 19th century New York. They hit other cities as well. They hit New York in particular, in part, yes, because of the overcrowding, so they also, however, brought forth the first real response, so that New York was an incredible pioneer in public health. And here's where, within a few decades, New York caught up to London and was as far forward and far thinking about the New York City Department of Public Health. I believe it's the oldest in the United States. It may well be the oldest in the world. And They were thinking about what causes epidemics, how can we deal with them, all kinds of problems. Again, sometimes they had some of the science, sometimes they didn't. Even when they didn't have the science, there were common sense things that they could, without understanding the microbiology of it, they could sort of understand how things were spreading. And there were incredible pioneers. A woman with the name of Josephine Baker, not to be obviously not to be confused with the great singer, African-American singer of the 1920s and 30s, Josephine. This was Dr. Josephine Baker, and she was she wasn't the director, but she was the deputy director of the Department of Health in New York. And it was she who brought incredible, they claimed she saved the lives of 90,000 children by going through the slums and bringing basic principles of sanitation, drinking milk, for example, making sure babies were properly clothed and fed to the degree that they could be, dealing with solvable infectious diseases of the day. And of course, her great claim to fame was tracking down this sort of mysterious outbreak of typhoid that was going on, typhus that was going on around the city, and finding a woman, a cook, Mary Mallon, Irish cook, who was at the center of these, and they realized that she was spreading it. And they gave her the name Typhoid Mary, the original Typhoid Mary. And then there's a whole wonderful story about that. But what's interesting broadly about that story to me is the idea of this kind of an urban, intrinsically urban, to some degree, intrinsically urban problem that brings forward an intrinsically urban response and a kind of resilience and a kind of brilliance of massing of minds and energies and resources that would not be possible elsewhere in the city, and in so doing brings all of the civilization with it. You know, basically, the solutions that they pioneer are not only for New York, but for the rest of the city. Now, as we go forward, there were, you know, obviously other kinds of catastrophes and fires, and the Triangle Fire, which we write a lot about. And then, and this continued, you know, on through the 20th century and into one kind of an issue or another. It's interesting to me, though, to distinguish between these certain kinds of problems, which cities are good at responding to and can treat and solve in many ways, you know, the water supply and doing this kind of thing, and problems which are more intractable and deeper rooted, because I think there's a lot of confusion going on now between the two. The two great examples of kind of deep-seated intractable problems that turn out to be much harder for the city to respond to, I can think of two great examples. The most obvious example was something that all New Yorkers of a certain age experienced, which was the, you know, multi-pronged decline of the city between, let's say, 1966 or 67 and 1995. The most obvious symbol of which was the problems of crime and disorder, in which the city just seemed to be spinning out of control, and that for all its wealth and all its resources, it could not do the most basic urban requirement of keeping its people essentially safe. And it didn't hit all groups equally, but everyone was affected by it. You'd have to be, I don't think there was any, no matter how wealthy you were affected by it if you lived in New York, and many people left New York. And this was a series of problems that, you know, were obviously multivalent. Crime and disorder was one kind of issue, the industrialization of New York, the loss of employment, obviously the financial troubles of the city in the 1970s. And, you know, people didn't know how to solve it. It was in this way, it was on a sort of local level, a little bit like the Depression. It was scary because people just nothing like it. It wasn't that nothing like it had ever happened, but there just didn't seem to be any toolkit to solve it. It was a mystery. The other great problem, we don't think of it this way, but in New York's history was, you know, in the early part of the 20th century was poverty. You know, poverty in New York was this massive issue, you know, of this giant influx of poor people and the terrible housing conditions that had sprung up. And, you know, there it was. There were 2 million tenements in New York. Not all the tenements were terrible, but a good half, more than half of them were. There was 1 million people living on the Lower East Side in 1900. And reformers could argue and do this. We talked about the health reformers doing this or that. Housing reformers were very active. There were economic reformers of various kinds, but it seemed a problem larger than any ability of people to address it in the scale that it needed to be addressed to. They were sort of chipping at the sides, and it turned out that actually both problems were ultimately solvable. The city did move on. I would say actually the second one was more tractable as a problem than the first one. We still have a lot of poverty in New York. 1 out of 5 New Yorkers lives below 1 out of 6 lives below the poverty line. You still have people living in terrible housing. It's not like it was in 1910, obviously. The great rise of the middle class in New York changed things. But these were kind of complex, thorny, knotted problems that were not solvable. In comparison to which, we now look back to look at the 4 crises of the last 20 years. One of the things our book and our episode will remind people, our memories are very short, is just how freaked out and terrified people were after 9/11. We have forgotten because we know now that there were no more 9/11s. I mean, there was the incident in London, and there have been incidents all around the world, but obviously nothing on the scale, sort of historical, world-shattering scale of 9/11. But people didn't know that then. People didn't know in the months after 9/11 that this wasn't just going to be part of daily life in New York, one way or the other. Maybe it wouldn't be that particular thing of flying an airplane into a building. That now people could put safeguards in place, both on the building side and more importantly on the airplane side, so that wasn't going to happen again. But maybe it would be something else. Suitcase nukes or anthrax. Remember, there was this mysterious anthrax attacks. Nobody knew what they were about. And we have just a lot of very striking quotes about how people said no one will work in a tall building again. No one will, who will work in a 110-story building? Who will work in a 60-story building? Who will live in a 27-story building? We predict the skyscraper is a typology that has failed and will never be built again. Of course, looks absurd to us today. But the Federal Reserve Bank was issuing advisories telling corporations to basically pull their assets and money out of New York because of the terrorist threat. And it was dire indeed there for a while. And so I think it's important to remember that and important to situate ourselves in that context. Again, when the financial crisis hit, it was obvious to everybody, as how wouldn't it be obvious, that the place that was going to be most impacted was the place, A, where it had begun, basically, and that it caused it, and B, the place that most lived and died on the financial industry. And the place where, if Wall Street shiver, whatever it is, sneezes, the New York gets a cold. But with remarkable speed, that didn't turn out to be true, in part because the federal government supported the financial institutions and made sure that there wouldn't be a recurrence of that and brought the economy back. But New York recovered faster, far faster than the rest of the economy. So that by 2009, it had gotten back all the jobs that it lost by 2010, I guess, it had gotten back all the jobs that it lost in the recession and was booming. And by 2010 and 2011 was booming again, as if nothing had ever happened. Superstorm Sandy is obviously a more complicated situation. The city did show an incredible amount of resilience. This is the theme again and again, particularly with things like 9/11, and Superstorm Sandy in a way is the best example of it. It was this catastrophic situation. 43 people died in New York City. The numbers, the amount of numbers of buildings that were damaged and the amount of economic damage that were done are really astonishing. I mean, incredible percentage of New York suddenly was underwater. But as people pointed out, there was no rioting, there were no shortages of food and water of size, and people did band together. They're incredibly moving stories. I'm working right now on a piece about Red Hook houses, which is low-income housing project, very large low-income housing project in Red Hook, Brooklyn, which Red Hook is kind of a peninsula that juts out into the harbor, and it's very low lying. And so the whole complex, the Red Hook complex, was flooded. And when it was flooded, all the mechanical equipment of the building, all the electrical and all the power, the heat, the light, everything was flooded and destroyed, completely destroyed. So for a good 14 days, people living in these high-rise housing units in the upper floors had no heat, they had no light. And many of them were elderly, many of them were in wheelchairs, no elevator service, couldn't possibly get down. Well, what happened? Well, able-bodied people banded together, breaks your heart, and they brought boxes and supplies and candles and food and water, and they carried them up in the dark with flashlights, carried them up, 5 and 6 flights and more, and brought them to people who needed help. And all across the city, people responded in different ways. It is absolutely true that the impact of Sandy was, really varied quite a lot. I mean, if you were an office building on Wall Street, that was one thing. Your building got flooded, and on Water Street, building got flooded, and it was out for several weeks or maybe even a couple of months. But inevitably, it was not going to be left standing. It was going to be, as such, it was going to be fixed up and rebuilt, and they were going to figure out ways to put the power plants in more resilient ways and so forth. Whereas there were neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn and Staten Island that went years without sufficient help, and houses. You can still see damage of Superstorm Sandy. So there was a great differential in the impact it had. But on the whole, the city showed its resilience again and recouped. And now, of course, in that case, the great challenge is, Sandy was, as Adam Sobel, a wonderful climatologist from Columbia, explains to us, you can't say Sandy happened because of climate change, but it certainly didn't, it helped. And he said very clearly, the fact that the sea levels are rising and have risen a foot on average absolutely meant that what would have been a problematic or difficult storm became a catastrophic one, because the water levels were just that much higher, and could go, a waterworks, all you need is a little bit of a grade and the water will go. So 7 times the area might have gotten flooded than might otherwise have been if the water had been a little lower. Well, that global rising is not going anywhere. We know that this is a global problem, and although obviously we're now happily, in my view, since our new administration came in, taking this more seriously than we were for a while, to put it mildly, and the rest of the world is taking it seriously. We're already on a trajectory such that this is a real, issue. We're going to continue to have these rising seas. So that was an interesting marker. And then, of course, came Sandy. I think I'm getting, now you'll tell me, Joe and Kirk, when you're ready to switch over to Q&A. I've just basically gotten up to the virus, but I'm happy to keep talking about it or to start taking questions from you, as you would like.
Well, I would be very interested in hearing about the counterpoint from the 60s and the 70s. I wasn't here, but I, as a kid, did come to the city and see the graffiti on the subways and saw the homeless in Times Square and all this other kind of stuff. However, I don't get a sense now that there is this existential hand-wringing about New York. There was then, right? People were fleeing to the suburbs. The city as a concept, as you were saying, was gone. But that doesn't seem to be the case now. Have we seen such a renaissance in the last, say, 30 years that people are not saying that the very idea of the city or New York is bad, but that it's just going to have to overcome these obstacles? Is there a different mindset?
Well, I would say in April of this year, there were people, Joel Kotkin and others, who were like, aha, you see, I told you cities were bad. And, some people have written, they were so convinced that urban living was bad, and that the real answer was in the suburbs and so forth. And frustrated by decade after decade of the last 2 decades, where more and more young people wanted to either live in New York itself or live in cities like New York, in dense urban places. And in many cases, not even, younger people not even getting their driver's license and things like that. And this, they were like, you see, we told you, we knew there was something wrong with New York. And here it's proved. And there was a lot of absurd confusion about, which is a confusion that many Americans have and many New Yorkers have, about the actual nature of what was happening, and particularly a confusion between the notion of density and overcrowding. They are often heard together, and this may have come up in earlier sessions. Jane Jacobs was very careful to distinguish between them for exactly the same reasons. But it was obvious from the very start that it couldn't possibly be density that was the problem, because first of all, item number one, there were cities like in the Far East, in Asia, that were far denser than New York, which had absolutely managed to control this thing. So that was one. And second of all, in New York, the place that it was least problematic was Manhattan. The place that it was most problematic was places like Corona, bizarrely named, coincidence, Corona, Queens, and other suburbs. And what was the answer to that? And the answer to that was density and overcrowding are two different things. An area like the Upper East Side of Manhattan has a density of 250 people per acre. That sounds pretty high, but they're living in apartment houses and everyone has a bedroom to themselves. So it is dense without being overcrowded. Now you switch over to Elmhurst or Corona, the density is less than half that of Manhattan. And to the look of it, there are these little houses and they're leafy streets and it looks kind of semi-suburban and looks pretty, safe and so forth. But there are 2 or so large families in those houses. And there might be 6 undocumented immigrants sleeping in the basements of those houses. They are overcrowded. And that is tinder to the fire of epidemic. And so that this had to be distinguished. And this was the old issue about Jane Jacobs dealing back in the old days with tenements were bad because they were overcrowded, not because they were dense. Right. There was nothing wrong with density. Density was good, but overcrowding is not good. And so that was, so there were people saying there was something intrinsically wrong with New York, and certainly a lot of people left. We don't know how many, and it was the original numbers were overblown. People were saying 5% of the population, and it didn't turn out to be anything like that. But certainly a couple of 100,000 people did go elsewhere and relocated for some period of time. And so that suddenly it was almost like a reptilian response of like, oh my God, the middle-class people are going again, are leaving again. So I think that was bringing on this, as you say, kind of hand-wringing about the future of the city. But, it was important to remember that there was nothing wrong with New York in January of 2020, except that the quintessential modern New York problem that too many people want to live here, and thus it's too expensive. There's the essential problem of the modern city, modern New York. Anyway.
But is that mindset of social distancing and being separate from everyone, is that going to work into the craw of the urban designer today when new things are being built and developed in the future? Because to your point, and I believe very strongly in the density of New York City, it's what gives it its energy. It's what makes it so special. Is that a potential pitfall moving forward?
It's hard to know. I mean, in principle, you can't have a city with separation and isolation. It just doesn't work. The things people love about the city, macro and micro, are people coming together and people being close. And that's what makes the city, that was the great change since the 1990s, was that the rediscovery that the future was at the macro level and the micro level. So let me explain what I mean by that. The corporations and companies and young talented people and startup companies and tech and all of that suddenly wanted to be not in the Silicon Valley type environment where everybody has their own car and it's all very spread out. And you almost never run into people who don't work for your company or whatever. You think of the Apple, you know, dome, the whatever they call it, you know, where no one can come and go. You can't get in, and you can't. I mean, you can go, but you can't go in. You can't meet anybody for lunch there because no, they won't let anybody in. It's complete, you know, Fort Knox. That at the macro level, that where the action was going to places where people would intersect with people in their own industry and interchange ideas, and a livelier market of like, oh, so and so got a job there. Oh, what's he getting paid? Oh, you know, and between industries, so that, you know, this was obvious in the case of tech, that tech stopped being about itself. It started being about everything else. Well, Silicon Valley is about tech. You don't go to Silicon Valley to learn about retail or advertising or architecture or any other thing besides tech. And so if you want to start being part of those worlds, why would you be in Silicon Valley? You go to the city where those things are, which could be San Francisco, but it obviously could be New York. So that's on the macro level. The micro level, it's the bars, you know, it's the crowded bar where you're going to hang out for, you know, this big demographic change in American life, where people used to get out of, you know, 50 years ago, people got out of college, and, you know, upper middle class people, and they would spend a year and a half living in New York, and they'd meet a nice girl or boy, and they would scoot off to the suburbs as fast as they could, get married and start a family. Doesn't work that way. Not only because people don't want to scoot off to the suburbs so quickly, but because they're not getting married for, instead of 15 months, they can take 15 years, you know. Think of Sex and the City, the whole, what's that show about? Except this whole new time in life for people after college and before, when they've left their own family, but before they've left the family they grew up in, they haven't yet built the family where they're the parents. Yep. And there's a new time in life for Americans, for upper middle class educated Americans. And what is that time? That time is bars and restaurants and cafes and opera and ballet and, you know, this and that, and physically being together. And that's the fun of it. And that's what New Yorkers have always known. That's the fun of it. And it's one of the things you don't get much of when you leave New York, or you leave cities like New York. So, you know, that obviously got wrecked, got ripped apart, you know, by COVID. You couldn't do it. You were not allowed to do it. And everything that people loved most about cities was, that kind of thing was ended. And in a way, people who left had the excuse that, well, why should I be living in the city with all the bad things when I don't have any access to the good things? And I might as well be in the suburbs because I can't do any of the things that I usually do here. So that's fair in a way. But you know, I think it goes down to like, where are we going to be in a year or 2 years when we've all gone back? You know, what will the amnesia level? This is why I brought up the 9/11 thing. We could not have imagined in, let's say, December 2001 or January 2002, that there would be a day where 9/11 would be this just historical thing that once happened in New York, you know, and there's a memorial and you go there and it's very sad. And of course, people who lost family members, that's a different story. But, you know, and everyone in New York sort of knew someone who knew someone. It was a great loss. But as a city, you know, that it would just be one more event in the history of New York, you know. Will this in 2 or 3 years be looked at as what a strange time that was? Thank God we're not like that anymore, and be kind of forgotten. Will it, you know, and these are the questions that are running around. Will it trigger? I haven't read any kind of interest. I've been thinking a lot about this, about the 1920s and about the kind of conventional thought about the 1920s was World War I had been this incredibly disruptive event, and that the certainties of 19th century, the long 19th century that had gone on until 1914, had been completely ripped to shreds and, you know, destroyed. And so young people had to kind of recreate their own world after 1918, 1919, and because of World War I. And then, you know, the flappers came and the Roaring Twenties came and Fitzgerald and Jazz Age, which all sounds plausible, but what degree did the Spanish flu play in this? What degree did, you know, with far more people died of the Spanish flu than died in World War I, as we now are reminded. There are no memorials to the Spanish flu, but tens of millions of people and millions of people in America and young people. That was what was really remarkable about the Spanish flu. Old people died of the flu, had always died of the flu and things like the flu, but young people didn't die of the flu so much, and suddenly they were. But did that play a role in kicking off the 20s? I don't know of any historian who's been thinking about it, but it might be a very good question now.
Yeah, no,
yeah. So are we going to see this great, rebirth? My sense is, I can't, unless there can be a recurrence. Of course, we don't know, some variant that we're not, aware of right now. But I can't help but think that if it's not an issue anymore, it's not an issue, and it will go into the kind of general amnesia of most people.
I would agree with you at some point. I mean, I think my son is almost 25 now, and he was a child during 9/11, but he doesn't relate to it the way that my wife and I do,
Right.
It's a very different thing. And it's something to know, it's something to feel, but it's not something to be traumatized by.
Right.
And it's just not going to be part of his procedure in the city.
Right. So but it is interesting. How did our lives really change? And they did change in some ways. Obviously, when you go to an airport, you have a different experience than you did in, let's say, 1989. You have to sign into office buildings because office managers decided that somehow would keep, Al-Qaeda from attacking us. I make the comment, as somebody who's spent their whole adult life in New York, that the New York of the 1970s and 80s was much more dangerous and closed in some ways. There were streets you didn't walk down because they were too scary or dangerous, but much more open in other ways. You could walk in, if you were walking down 6th Avenue and you could call, there were no cell phones, but you didn't even have to call. You could just go up. Imagine this, young people. You could go into the lobby of an office building, go up in the elevator, and announce yourself at the office person to a friend to see if they were interested in having lunch. Yeah. You didn't have to call, you didn't have to do anything. You just walk right up. I used to wander around Grand Central Terminal as a kid, just wander in all the little, it's unbelievable where I would go. And that in that way, the city is much more closed and tight now. There are all sorts of places you can't. The whole security apparatus, the bollards and the sally ports and the guard booths and all of that. It's not like they didn't exist before, but that was obviously dramatically expanded after 9/11. We still live with that. We still live with this, seeing, we've kind of forgotten, but seeing soldiers in Grand Central Terminal with automatic weapons. That didn't happen in New York in the worst of the 70s and the 80s. That was unimaginable. That was the stuff of a sci-fi movie. So my point is that there have been remnants that have lasted all these many years, 20 years later, that have changed our lives. What will be their equivalents for COVID? We don't know yet.
I was just going to ask you what you see is going to be the lingering effect of COVID. What would you?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, we can, and it opens the larger question of sort of like how are different parts of the city going to come back, and in what order, basically, which I think is close to the heart of what your series has been about. And we've been giving this a bit of thought. Already it's obvious to me that the residential market, for example, in New York, is right back on track. The bargains are gone. And anyone who was smart, there's a wonderful old saying, when there's blood on the street, buy property. Never has that old saying been so powerful. If you were smart and you believed in the city, about 7 months ago, you could get a bargain because people, were selling their apartments and renting their apartments, and everybody, there was what had happened in New York is I think not so much that people were leaving their rental apartments, but that rental apartments churn over all the time, and every year there's an incredible number of people leaving their apartments, but there's new people coming in, and that was what had changed. Not so much that people were leaving in greater numbers, but that new people weren't coming in for some period of time.
Right.
And so the rents were relatively low, and you could get a bargain. Well, that's done. Maybe a few more months of relative bargains, but that's plainly over now. And I've been told that some landlords are holding, particularly in the rental market, they're holding a good number of apartments off the market because they don't want to rent them now, because they see that in 4 months, they'll 6 months or whatever it is, it's worth it to them to hold up. So it seems to me that that's going to go back, but it may have had, and this is where we get to sort of interesting territory, it might have had, I think there were all kinds of people who, if you really believed in the city, might have rented an apartment at a 20% discount that they wouldn't have been able to afford before, and now are going to be here for a few years. So maybe there's been a lot of talk about the reset, but the idea that maybe there will be some new people coming to the city that would have been priced out, that, the good part of the 70s and 80s was all kinds of people could move here that couldn't afford it necessarily afterward or before. But in that window of time, we're given a space to move here.
I'm just saying, the one thing I think I'm most excited about, that is, I think, a direct result of the pandemic, is the variety in retail. With rents going down, people are able to take chances with wacky and esoteric shops and stores, and the city needs that, I think, as anything else. I'm really excited about that.
It was, retail obviously retail was a big problem before. So a thing had happened, the financialization of retail space, that was really hurting New York, and I think it was really a problem. That as you can pin it in part on the giant increase in the number of tourists in New York, which had gone through the good efforts of first Mayor Bloomberg's NYC and Co, and then continued under de Blasio, had just gone to, I think they had hit 65 million visitors a year, which would have been an unimaginable number even 12 years ago. In part because of that, and because of the incredible high traffic volume, pedestrian traffic volume we were having on streets like Broadway, where I live, down in Tribeca and Soho, and other streets around the city. Not real estate owners so much, but REITs, real estate investment trusts, and other groups like that were like, how much the stuff is worth? You're renting to some guy there. Don't do that. We can leverage that, potential rent that you could get, and we'll leverage that, and you'll make a ton of money. And so all those tricks of the, dicing and slicing and the, all that stuff that they were doing that got us into so much trouble in 06 and 07, they were applying some version of that to retail. And they were, giving these, just sugar plums in front of these owners that they could get all this kind of money, even without renting their space. And in fact, that was kind of the thing. You couldn't rent the space at less than the imagined value that it had. So what did we see? We saw block after block. Certainly Broadway here, every block was half empty or more. And then pandemic hit, and it was that much worse. I do see a lot of pop-ups happening now, but I'm still anxious about that for New York. I still think with the internet and all of that, I think that's still a serious issue for the city.
Joe.
I want to jump in here because we have a shy group this week, but there is a question that picks up on things you were just discussing, James, about lingering effects. And this is a phenomenon that existed before COVID, but I wonder if its lingering effect, I have a question for you about it. I was reading an article about kind of cultural currents recently, and the writer, whose name I don't remember, described the one-click approach to daily life that we live in right now, popularized by Amazon, of course, which was already taking hold before the pandemic, but only strengthened during COVID. So my question is, do you fear that New Yorkers might be less willing to re-engage with the physical world post-pandemic, if they can now work from home, do all their shopping, watch all their movies, watch all their plays online? Is that a problem we should be worried about?
Well, yeah, I don't think it's not a problem. I do think that New York wouldn't have existed. There was, you could always have an easier life. Not always, but I mean, the last 70 years, if you were looking for convenience, you could always have an easier life in the suburbs. You didn't live in Manhattan or dense parts of Brooklyn or other without a car. The one thing that in American life made everything sort of easily accessible, and which, for example, came into your garage so that you didn't even have to step out into the rain. And then on the other end, you went into some garage and didn't have to step out into the rain. This is not the way New York works. You have to go out into the rain, and you have to go down into a subway, and you have to get out of the rain, get out of the subway and get out of the rain and go someplace. So yes. New York's appeal has never been that it's the easiest place to live, if that's what you're looking for. Once you know how the city works, you find it remarkably convenient. And I must say, I spent quite a bit of time in Los Angeles, and I'm always sort of startled at how, like, to a New Yorker, you have to get in the car and then you're in traffic and then you have to find a place to park. And then that doesn't seem that easy to me, actually. Whereas I pop in the subway, I know where all the exits are and everything. It's like New York is my magic carpet. But, people went to theater. They rather than sit at home and watch television, which most of America did every evening, they went out and they went to the theater, and they went to little off-Broadway shows, and they went to find out little Albanian restaurants here and there, and where nobody knew where they were. And that made New York work, even with the enormous counterbalance of the one-click lifestyle, which was not, so it's gotten a little easier. And there are certainly people who live in New York and who shop on Amazon. So what can I say? I mean, it's a concern, but I also think that it's, New York, or the compact of New York, is so fundamentally different than that. It's based on physical engagement with the world. And in some cases, I don't know. I mean, it is hard to say. And the world has been moving in. New York apartments have been getting bigger, and they've been getting more suburban. And everybody I look across the street at a loft buildings in Tribeca, and everyone has a big oversized television. These young, 20-something, 30-something New Yorkers. Everybody has a big suburban style entertainment thing, and in the evening they're there. So I think it was, independent. I loved, and I wrote my book, Celluloid Skyline, based on going to the old revival houses in New York. The Film Forum is still going, but all those private revival, they're all gone. People won't go out to see old movies anymore. They'll see them on TCM. So I do think they're real issues, and they're big issues. I'm not sure, and pandemic may have exacerbated them, but I don't think it's the end of them. I think people underestimate the resilience of the thing. And if we get more young people, because you get cheaper apartments, then the young people really love to do that. It's older people who don't want to go out so much.
Okay. I have one other question, and it's based on something when you were speaking earlier about the two intractable problems: crime, law and order, and also poverty. And I've been wondering whether inequality is going to be one of the foremost problems in New York City going forward. It's always been a problem, but I was struck by something Catherine Wild said to us several weeks ago. She was talking about the tax base in New York City and stressing how the pandemic moves of a lot of rich people to their other houses in the Hamptons or wherever, Nantucket, was a real concern for the business community, because if New York lost just its 100 richest people, the tax revenues would suffer so dearly, hundreds of millions of dollars out of the coffers, that it would be a capital C catastrophe for the city, according to Kathy Wild. And so I wonder, there's this long-standing tension between wooing millionaires and billionaires to maintain our tax base, while simultaneously funding all the initiatives that we know we need to fund in the near future, like universal pre-K, but also the climate remediation that has to
Mhm.
happen on our waterfront. So the question is, can New York City successfully square that circle of, keeping the rich people around and happy, while also investing in the rest of the other 99% in the profound ways we need to?
Well, these obviously go to very fundamental issues about New York and about the powerful, wealthy cities of the world, of which New York and London I have sort of in a category of their own. I mean, first of all, let's stop and take a deep breath. The several hundred, or even if it's several thousand people who live, for example, in those towers on Central Park South, which everybody sees and pisses everybody off in one way or another, they don't cause the problem of the real problem of being poor in New York is housing affordability. It's become a growing, it was always a problem, but it's become a growing problem. That is not caused by those people. A few thousand apartments doesn't cause, in a city of 8.5 million people, does not cause the problem. The problem is all the nice people, all the just middle class people who have come back to the city in droves, and they have driven up the price of housing in New York. And that is affordability. I feel very strongly that although inequality is a favorite subject, it is not the right subject. The subject is affordability. That is the problem. Inequality, in some level, you want some inequality. As Esther Fuchs and other people say, Detroit doesn't have a problem with inequality because nobody has much money. But if you were trying to survive and trying to make a living and trying to get ahead in life, would you rather go to Detroit or New York? Of course you would rather come to New York because there are more opportunities here. Well, there are more opportunities here because there are more middle class people here when the bigger tax base and economic machinery. Of course, the other thing you said is absolutely true. New York spends by orders of magnitude, not orders of magnitude, but dramatically more on social services than not only most parts of the United States, but most big cities. New York City's budget is larger than, or about the same as, the budget of the entire state of Florida, which has what, 4 times as many people. And we don't maintain an army. We have a police force, okay, seem like an army, but that money goes to hospitals, to schools, to clinics, to fire department, to plus all the things you mentioned, remediation, K-12, That's how that stuff gets paid for. And you can rant and rave about rich people annoying you, but really, as Mayor Bloomberg and others have said, 40% of the personal income tax in New York is paid effectively by millionaires. And they are subsidizing the vast amounts that are spent. Now, is it enough that's being spent? Or, of course not. We could use improvements in all areas, but you cannot say that New York is ignoring these people relative to anywhere else in the United States. Maybe compared to Copenhagen, that's another story. But so I think these are complicated things. I mean, I do think the leaving New York thing was a little, it was very, people got excited about it, people got worried about it. My sense is most of those folks are going to drift back to the city because, for the simple reason that, this hedge fund guy said, the problem with moving to Florida is you have to live in Florida. Well, a lot of people like to live in Florida, but rich people like to be near other really rich people, and they like to be they like to be where that they can go to the opening at the Whitney, or they can be on the board of the Whitney or whatever like that. And being on the board of the Sarasota Museum isn't quite the same. And my guess is that a lot of those people will drift back, and New York also is very good at producing millionaires. So new ones will arrive. Certainly we saw that the tech, talking about people who were smart and who had a long-term vision in the worst months of this, the tech companies, Google and Facebook and Apple and Amazon, they were buying up all over the city. They weren't a fool's they were like, we're going to get bargains that we'd have to wait, that are never going to come again. So they made a huge investment. And my guess is that has been a great source of inequality, if you're interested, that we have what most other cities, and that's another important point to make, New York provincialism and New York self-centeredness is, knows no bounds. But, there are 50 cities across the United States who would love to have the problem that New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco have. Too many well-to-do people wanting to live there and pay taxes there. You go to, Cleveland or Akron or places like that, that is not a problem that they have. And let us remember that. The problem of American cities is that broadly is that not enough well-to-do people want to live there. There are a handful of these cities where too many are. Now, how do we get it just right? We've never gotten it just right, and we never will. I don't think we can. That said, there are many things we can do and ways we can spend funds, and we can. New York, in one sense, if you want to think about it, is a giant social redistribution machine. It takes the money from the rich people and puts it to help all the people who aren't rich. And it's always, not always, but it's since the 1920s and 30s, that's what it's done. And we need to keep doing it. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Back to you, Kirk.
Thanks, Joe. James, we want to thank you very much for your time. I got one last question for you.
Okay.
Out of the pandemic, what is the most shining, wonderful thing on the horizon for New York City?
That's a really good question. Hard to say. I'm trying to think of like one single thing that is going to happen. I mean, certainly we're very happy that we have an administration now that will support Gateway, because that's a huge deal. So building Gateway and in theory, bringing high-speed rail into New York and redoing Penn Station probably would be, if you had to pick one like single project, that would be the single project that would have the largest impact, because it will build on every strength New York has always had, not always, had it for 50 years and then it lost it for 50 years. Now it has it again, of being part of the nexus of these powerful, well-to-do cities that are, stretched from Washington to Boston, and to encourage that kind of using train rather than car or airplane traffic, and then redeveloping that area of the city, and then in the 30s, and then generally just for the safety and resilience of the city to have the new tunnel and so forth. Because if we did lose those tunnels, God forbid, that would be, it's a catastrophe, as I'm sure Tom Wright talked to you about.
Yes, and just incidentally, James, Tom Wright said exactly the same thing you just did, that the Gateway was the #1 priority for the city.
Yeah, I would say he believe, he's the RPA, so that's what they love. But I would say, that thinking about the whole city and not even just in physical terms, like what's the most important for the future. And, our beautiful thing that did happen in the middle of all this was the Moynihan Station opened after all these years. And we had this fantastic, and it came, and it was such a thing to think about, that, we're not just going to get back to where we were, but we're going to have this beautiful new way of getting into the city that we dreamed of for 20 years. And in a way begins to repair, what happened with the demolition of Penn Station, and that we can be a better city. And I would say, to finish this thought, that, we didn't even begin to talk about all the things that came alongside the pandemic, specifically George Floyd, and we're on the anniversary right now, and Black Lives Matter. But, there was, and Justin Davidson and others have talked about this, we fall into our ways, as even good liberal New Yorkers that we are, middle-class New Yorkers that we are, we still fall into our ways of thinking about society in a certain way. But when you were there in late March and there were no restaurants and you couldn't go anywhere, and the only way you were getting fed was some guy on a bike from, Costa Rica, terrified for his life, because everybody was, but he couldn't take the time off. He couldn't stop doing what he was doing. And you were completely dependent on this person in a way you never had been. You were, it was life or death, literally. You would not get food if this person didn't come to your house and bring you food. It was a powerful thing. It made people think about, I do think it had a changing way of people thinking about society, reminding them what we kind of intellectually know, but was made very visceral and very real, that this society works with all these different people working together, and our responsibility is to this all of these groups, and to remember how extraordinary they are. We're so proud of ourselves because we're entrepreneurial and doing tech and doing this. Well, they are extraordinary in their way, and they were courageous and death-defying, one might say, so that we could for minimum wage, so that we could be fed, And so I think that's not a thing. It's not like Gateway, but maybe that's something that will come out of the city that will be better.
I agree with you. It reveals, just like the other things that we saw, Sandy and 9/11, it reveals the resilient spirit of this town. And, and you were also saying it is a tough town to live in, but if it makes you tough as well, then there's some benefits of that as well.
Absolutely.
James, I want to thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Great evening.
Great.
Joe,
all right. Thanks, everybody.
I really appreciate that. I want to just say a quick thanks to not only Joe, who has spent many of these evenings posing these questions and fielding them from the attendees. I also want to thank Erica Dubno, who took part in this and was a great encouragement as well for the conference throughout its entirety. I want to thank my wife, Rini, who also fielded questions several times during the conference. And for all the guests, James, and for everyone before him who have spoken. I think we have learned an incredible a lot about our city. Some of these things include the realization that New York will almost certainly become the playground of the young as a new roaring 20s, as James was talking about, as Kenneth talked about earlier. Kenneth Jackson is already in evidence. Our theater and other entertainment industries will first be supported by the surrounding region. We learned that as well. As the world inoculates, it's going to take a longer time for the world to get up to speed as far as the vaccine is concerned, and then begin to slowly move back to the city. And we have some stops and starts with how we're going to proceed with people coming, around the country and around the world. Government at all levels will need to infuse money into our economy to restore our pathways, our tunnels, our train tunnels, and support our newest arrivals, our immigrants, the ones who are coming here for the first time, who are coming to uncertainty, and to bring them some support along the way, make this place an attractive place to be resilient. Technology will be the defining business sector, and will divide those who possess its skills and those who do not. There are still many unknowns. What if the critical masses of people who pollinate the city do not return? The immigrant, the tourist, the business traveler, the office worker. New York will simply not be a healthy place unless they reappear, and reappear quickly. The city must let the world know it is a safe, thrilling, and productive place to be. But as Kenneth Jackson has said, nobody made money betting against New York. It will always have a turbulence, a fresh blood, a collision of new experiences and generations who have yet to arrive here, who do not think like you and I do. At the turn of the 20th century, New York City was the busiest port in the US, and trade was its dominant industry. A century later, the piers that ring Manhattan are long gone or repurposed for recreation, and the remaining warehouses now expensive Tribeca lofts. The city shed its manufacturing and blue-collar image for more offices, for digital startups, for biotech, for healthcare, for the city we have today. The change is not measured in hours, but a time-lapse camera for just a few years would show how remarkable the transformation can be. The city will thrive because it was never meant to stay the same. If you love New York and you want to see its revival, don't worry about shelling out the big bucks at fancy restaurants or expensive retailers, although that would be very much appreciated. If you want to see the ushering in of a new era for New York, just be here. The masks are off. They're coming off, certainly. So walk its streets, absorb its energy, wonder at its complexity and at the miracle that this crushed and compact space, carrying the full range of humanity, functions so amazingly. Let's go reinvent it together. We'll see you all very soon. Have a great evening.